Hello there and welcome back to another episode of the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. If it is your first time listening to the podcast, it is great to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time. I would love it if you could subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform that you are on. And if you have listened before and you're returning, if you haven't subscribed, I'd love it if you could subscribe. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming back and listening to another episode. In this episode, we are going to be talking about podcast show notes, because something that I've noticed is that people can be really, really great at show notes and write really in-depth show notes, or people can write show notes which are just a few sentences long and just not that amazing. So I'm going to go through some top tips for creating your podcast show notes, and then I'm going to give you an amazing hack right at the end. So make sure you stick around to listen to that, because this writing your podcast show notes is just chef's kiss, absolutely amazing. It's what I use all of the time. So to begin with, what are podcast show notes? I like to think podcast show notes is essentially like the blurb of a book. Podcast show notes are basically a written summary of the content discussed in a podcast episode. So as I said, very, very similar to the blurb of a book. They typically include a brief overview of the episode, key takeaways, quotes, and links to any other resources or relevant information mentioned during the podcast. The whole purpose of show notes is to help your listeners to navigate the episode and provide a reference point for future use as well. So it's not just about saying, hey, this is my episode, I can't really be bothered to write about it. It's to draw people into the episode if maybe they're sitting on the fence about listening to it. Or, even in the future, if people discover your podcast months, years from now, then they can go through the show notes and decide whether or not they want to listen to that particular episode. So when people ask, do you need show notes or do you need good show notes? The answer is yes. Your podcast show notes are prime real estate for potential listeners to find you by searching for keywords associated with the keywords used within your show notes and your podcast. And as I said before, if someone is on the fence about listening to your episode, the show notes might mean the difference between a download and a new subscriber versus losing that listener to another show. So what can you do to really help your podcast show notes or to stand out? I like to start off with the headline, because I think that the headline, the title for your episode, call it what you will, really helps lead into the show notes. So start with something catchy and something that gives you a good overall of the episode. So remembering as well that the title, the headline's the first thing that somebody sees about your podcast. So it needs to be attention grabbing and also engaging. And that well-crafted headline should really accurately reflect the content of your episode whilst also piquing your listeners' interest. So it's really important to avoid these really vague, generic headlines. You also don't want to go to the other extreme, something that's too clickbaity. It needs to be sitting somewhere in the middle. It's enough to entice somebody in without giving everything away. And as I said, just making things seem really clickbait. The first thing you're going to do within your show notes is create a brief overview of your episode. It's really important to provide that brief overview, and that summary might only be a sentence, couple of sentences long, but it needs to give your potential listener a good idea as to what they can expect from your episode. And then you can go on to highlight main points and any main topics which are also discussed within your episode. By summarizing your episode in this way, you can really help your audience to understand the focus and the purpose of your episode and potentially capture their interest in the content as well. Timestamps is something else that you can include. Timestamps are not exclusive for YouTube only. There are some podcast directories which enable timestamps and listeners to be able to skip to key parts of a podcast episode. And even if you can't skip to a specific timestamp, then your listener can look at the timestamps and then scroll themselves to those different timestamps if they're only interested in listening to a certain section, or they want to go back to a certain section. Say if they've listened to the episode before, but they want to dive into another bit specifically without listening to the entire episode. Again, timestamps, as I said, really, really useful and really easy to generate as well. And you can use a few different pieces of software to do that. Generating timestamps on using software such as otter.ai is really, really easy, and also on summarize.com. And check out the show notes for both of those links. My biggest bit of advice when it comes to writing show notes is to not overcomplicate it. Use language which is easy to understand, because that is what is going to make your show notes as accessible as they possibly can be to as many people as possible. So write it in a way which is easy to understand. Avoid technical jargon or complicated language that might turn off potential listeners, and instead use language which is friendly, approachable, and also engaging. And if you want any help with making sure that your writing is easy to read, then there is this amazing website called Hemingway app. It's completely free. I'll leave the link down in the show notes for this episode. And what Hemingway app actually does is it grades your writing and tells you how understandable it is to the general population. Essentially, the lower the writing grade that Hemingway app gives you, the more easily people can read your show notes. My next tip is for ensuring that you are being descriptive. Your show notes need to be descriptive enough to give your listeners a good idea of what to expect from the episode. And each podcaster is different in how they describe the contents of their episodes, with some podcasters going into a lot of depth, almost writing a kind of mini blog post as part of their show notes, whereas others like me do prefer shorter sentences, bullet points, and something a bit more condensed, but still having enough description to bring people into the episode. I like to use bullet points as well in my show notes, because I find that using bullet points helps make the show notes easily scannable and easy to just read and quickly go through. So if somebody is on the fence about listening to an episode, then they can just go through really quickly and go, yeah, this is the information that I want, I'm going to listen to it. Or even when I'm saying to people, go to the show notes and get this link or find out more information in the show notes, if it's in bullet points, it's easy for someone to just skim through and get the link or get the information that they need, and they're not wasting all of this time trying to just find something and then they're like, actually it's easier to go to Google. Using bullet points for any links mentioned in your episode, in your show notes, is also really, really key. Also, don't forget SEO. So search engine optimization refers to the process of optimizing digital content such as web pages or podcast episode show notes, with the aim of increasing visibility and ranking in search engine results pages such as Google, YouTube, Bing, TikTok, etc. So as a podcaster, optimizing your show notes for SEO can help you to reach a larger audience and potentially attract more listeners. And what you need to do here is incorporate relevant keywords and phrases into your episode descriptions and titles, your show notes, and that will help increase the likelihood of your show appearing in search results when potential listeners search for content related to their niche, their question, whatever it is that they're searching for. Also, well-optimized show notes make it easier for listeners to find specific episodes. In conclusion, when it comes to writing show notes for your podcast, yes, they are absolutely vital, and well-written show notes can make such a difference to the overall experience of somebody coming into your world and listening to your podcast. Now, I did say at the beginning that I was going to tell you exactly what it is that I use to create my own podcast show notes, and I use a program online called summarize.com. Summarize is absolutely incredible. You either upload your audio, your video, or you can put a link to a YouTube video. What it does is within about 60 seconds, it's minutes, it will go through your entire episode and it will give you show notes, it will give you timestamps, it will give you hashtags, social media posts, an email template to promote to your email list, it will give you blog posts. It goes on and on. It gives you so much content, and I find that using that to create my show notes means that writing show notes and promotional materials in general for my podcast episodes takes literally 15 minutes, because all I need to do is go through, I tweak some bits so that I make it sound a little bit more like me, and put some links in the bottom, and there we go, I'm good to go. So I would really recommend checking out Summarize, and if you use the link down in the show notes, then you will get 60 minutes of content for free, which is amazing. Anyway, on that note, I hope that you have enjoyed this episode all about show notes. Thank you so much for spending your time with me, and I will see you next episode.